Hello and welcome to this video on Wide Sargasso Sea aimed at A-level students. This is an introduction to what is an absolutely fabulous novel. And while you're watching the video, make sure you use the Cornell note-taking system to record your ideas, and I've put a template for how that would work on the screen. So pause the video, copy down the template, and then you're good to go. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with introducing the author Jean Rhys, who is the writer of Wide Sargasso Sea. She was born in 1890 as Ella Gwendolyn Rhys Williams in Dominica, which is an island in the Caribbean. Her mother was of Scottish descent and her family had previously been slave owners on Dominica for several generations. Her father wasn't from that part of the world. He was a Welsh ship's doctor. So for several reasons, Rhys would have felt separated from the different groups that lived on the island at the time. She would have felt separated from the people who were descended from the former slaves. And because of who her father was, she would probably feel separated as well from the people who were descended from the kind of former planter colonial groups. Within post-emancipation Caribbean, the Williams family, as I've just said, probably felt insecure, and this is a feeling that haunts Antoinette throughout Wide Sargasso Sea. In 1907, Rhys travelled to England to attend school, and she later studied dramatic art in London for just 2 terms. After that, she had a series of jobs, which included working as a chorus girl and in a railway canteen during the First World War. She then married her first husband in 1917, and they lived in various European cities. In 1922, however, she discovered that her husband was a bigamist, and this is another theme that echoes throughout Wide Sargasso Sea, as we'll come on to later. Rhys stayed in Paris and began to write. Then she returned to London in 1932 and she remarried. However, after that, she developed an alcohol addiction, and her second husband died in 1945. She then remarried her third husband in 1947. She didn't begin to write Wide Sargasso Sea until the 1950s, and again it was long in the gestation. It wasn't published until 1966, which was 13 years before her death in 1979. And she lived in poverty for much of her later life, and she wasn't particularly well known as an author. So why are these details important about her life? I'm not prone to doing biographical readings of a text, and I think it's really important that we don't look at the characters in a novel as being a representation of the novelist's own life. However, there are some themes from Jean Rhys's life which do echo across Wide Sargasso Sea. So first of all, she was born into a society in which she may have felt alienated from other social groups. And we see this in both Antoinette and also Rochester's experience in the novel. She travelled across the world, moving from one culture to another radically different one, again as both Antoinette and Rochester do. And both of those key characters experience a feeling of dislocation and separation and shock as they move from one culture to another. Jean Rhys also experienced betrayal in her marriages, and that again particularly is relevant to Rochester and the fact that he tries to become a bigamist later on. And Jean Rhys would have had a deep kind of understanding of alcohol addiction and the reasons behind that, which again is relevant to Antoinette's character. So the inspiration for Wide Sargasso Sea is perhaps better known than Jean Rhys's novel itself. Many people will have seen adaptations of Jane Eyre on the TV or in the cinema, and many people will also have read this book from the kind of early 19th century. In the novel, Jane Eyre, who's the eponymous narrator, is orphaned. She starts the novel living with some very unloving relatives, and then she's sent away to a boarding school. She finds a job as a governess in the mysterious Thornfield Hall with her even more mysterious employer, Mr. Rochester. She is a governess to a young girl who lives at that hall, who turns out to be the illegitimate child of Rochester. So Rochester already in Jane Eyre has a history of different romantic relationships which would have been outside of acceptable society for the time. And Jane, when she starts being a governess, is a very young a lady, possibly in her early 20s. She's very innocent, she's very naive, and she's just trying to survive in what is a very difficult world for her. Jane and Rochester, obviously, inevitably, it's the Victorian period, fall in love and plan to marry. However, a Mr. Mason arrives from the Caribbean to disrupt the wedding, and it's discovered that Rochester is already married to Bertha, who is then referred to as the mad woman in the attic. And after that, the story of Rochester's past unravels. We discover that he's the second child in an upper-class family, and he's sent to the Caribbean by his father and his older brother to marry a beautiful heiress. However, after the marriage, he finds that he's been tricked so that his family can reap the financial reward. His wife, it turns out, is mad and violent, and he just wants to forget about the marriage, forget about everything. So he travels back to England, bringing Bertha with him, and he locks Bertha in the attic and just tries to eliminate her from his mind. Significantly for Wide Sargasso Sea, within Bronte's narrative we never hear Bertha's version of events. So in Jane Eyre we accept Rochester's account that his wife is mad, she's violent, and she was already like that before he married her, and that he was tricked into that marriage without really understanding his wife's true character. Now, what we find in Wide Sargasso Sea is actually it's possibly that Antoinette, Bertha, isn't like that before she gets married, and it's perhaps her marriage to Rochester, who mistreats her, that causes her mental illness. So within Jane Eyre, Bertha, or Antoinette as she's called in Wide Sargasso Sea, Bertha is silenced and marginalised, often seen as a plot device to add tension. So she's a barrier to Rochester and Jane's marriage, and a barrier that they have to overcome in order to achieve a successful denouement to the novel. Now that is of course a reductive reading of Jane Eyre, and I would recommend going away and looking at the deeper complexities of that novel if you have time to do that. Okay, so when Jean Rhys read Bronte's novel, she discovered that there was this mysterious character that she wanted to write a backstory for. And the critic Angela Smith, in the introduction to Wide Sargasso Sea, says that Rhys hears voices that Bronte's novel pushes to the margins or out of hearing. And this novel is all about reclaiming those voices and helping Antoinette or Bertha to articulate her experience of living in a colonial society in the Victorian world, of living in a patriarchal society, and the damage that both of those cultures do to her as a young woman. And central to our understanding of Wide Sargasso Sea is something that Antoinette says quite early on in the novel. Antoinette insists that there is always the other side. So we only get Rochester's side of the story in Jane Eyre. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Antoinette gives the other side of the story. However, when Rochester narrates his section of Wide Sargasso Sea, he gives a different version of events again. So there's always a kind of ambiguity about what the truth is and whose perspective is correct. And perhaps all of their perspectives are correct in some way. It is a very postmodern novel, after all. Given that Wide Sargasso Sea responds to Jane Eyre, one of the key critical texts to look at is The Mad Woman in the Attic by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gobar. Now this is from Second Wave Feminism. It was published in 1979, and it's a series of essays exploring Victorian literature from a feminist perspective. And in this book, Gilbert and Gobar propose that Victorian writers tended to create female characters who were either the angel or the monster. So we've got this very polarised attitude to femininity in these texts. So an example of the angel would be Jane Eyre, and the monster would be Bertha Rochester. And Victorian novelists often use this kind of polarised representation of femininity to warn their readers against being the monster and to encourage them to be the angel in the home almost. And a lot of Victorian novels had a kind of educational function in that way. And I suppose in a sense, whilst Jane Eyre challenges the patriarchy by presenting a very independent female character, it also cements these patriarchal assumptions that the woman in a relationship is going to eventually kind of be less dominant than her husband. Again, there's a much more complex reading of Jane Eyre as possible, but this is the one that's relevant for understanding Wide Sargasso Sea. So like Rhys, Gilbert and Gobar emphasised the idea that Victorian literature did not reflect the reality of female experience, and Rhys sought to uncover that reality and give previously marginalised women a voice. So now that we know a bit of the background of the text, let's actually start to get into the text itself, and we're going to look here at the setting of Wide Sargasso Sea. So part one of the novel opens on the family estate in the early 19th century, and the estate is called Calibri, and it's on the Caribbean island of Jamaica. Jamaica was a Spanish colony in the 16th and 17th centuries, but was invaded by English forces in 1655, which then led to a period of conflict between England and Spain, resulting in England claiming the island as a colony for themselves. And we see that history in the novel through the names of the places particularly. So we have Calibri, which is a kind of local name for the estate that Antoinette lives on. They live near a Spanish town, which is referred to as well. During the 18th century, the island of Jamaica was very well known for production of sugar, coffee, cotton and indigo, and these crops were grown on estates controlled by planters who would have been the white settlers and worked by slaves. Now the British abolished the slave trade in 1807, but slavery was not outlawed within the empire until 1834. So there's a period there of just under 30 years where slavery was still taking place within Jamaica, but where slaves were not allowed to be transported and sold. And at the start of Wide Sargasso Sea, it's just after the Emancipation Act, so Antoinette's family and their neighbour are reeling from the loss of labour, and the Calibri estate has fallen into disrepair now that they no longer have any slaves. And this history led to a very fractured society with several groups. So we have the former slaves and the former slave owners in the novel. On the island as well at the time there would have been Irish workers, as well as immigrants from other parts of the Caribbean. So we find out that Christophine and Annette in Wide Sargasso Sea are from an island called Martinique. The term Creole is often used as well in relation to this novel, and it's used to describe the descendants of European settlers born in the Caribbean. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Make sure you finish off your note-taking sheet, and in the next video we're going to be looking specifically at the character of Antoinette in part 1 of Wide Sargasso Sea.